OK。はい、皆さん、こんにちは。米国特許セミナー ExaminIrks を始めたいと思います。いつも各週火曜日のランチタイムにお届けしています。講師は特許弁護士であるブライアン・エプスタインさんです。今回は第6回目になります。今回は米国出願を行う前に元の日本出願が先に許可された場合に米国での審査を迅速に行うためにはどうすればいいかについてご解説いただきたいと思います。それではブライアンさんにお話しいただきたいと思います。OK, Brian さん。Non-US applicants generally pursue American patents as part of an international portfolio. In some cases, non-US application is allowed before the US application is allowed. Applicants might want to expedite US prosecution without irking their examiners. Do you have any tips?
Yeah, absolutely. Today's topic is directed to PPH program, Patent Prosecution Highway, and allowable claims. So welcome everybody. Yokoso. So amendments, sometimes examiners are get annoyed with applicants because the amendments and PPH applications do not comply with amendment rules. In particular, applicants in PPH cases have a limited ability to amend the claims, in particular with regard to the independent claims. This is different than the requirements of a typical amendment. In particular, for PPH cases, applicants can only generally only amend the independent claim by taking a feature in a dependent claim and moving it into the independent claim. The amendments to independent claims can also address, particular issues like indefiniteness. If your examiner is of the opinion that the amendment, complies with the PPH program, it's a different set of requirements. The claims have to substantially correspond to the allowed claims in a foreign application, aside from the dependent claims. And that's why it's important to add these, to have features in the dependent claims that are rolled into the independent claim. And so what can applicants do to try to lessen the impact of the PPH program? So the first thing is to bring the application to 20 claims as soon as possible. Why 20? So the obvious reason is that, when you file a US patent application, the PTO does not charge any additional fees for 20 total claims. Not all jurisdictions are like that. For example, in Japan, my understanding is that applicants pay per claim. And so, maybe an applicant only wants to pay for 7 claims. But in the US, we get 20 claims for filing an application, 20 total claims. And so a typical strategy is to file these claims in some sort of preliminary amendment, particularly because the PPH filing requires a preliminary amendment to begin with. Other times people add these claims as part of their response to the first office action. But in all cases, you want to get as many features in the dependent claims as possible, as early as possible, because that will help reduce the prosecution time. Because again, the typical amendment to a claim requires that the feature be presented first in a dependent claim in response to one office action, and then incorporated from the dependent claim into the independent claim in response to a second office action. In other words, it takes about twice as long, twice as many office actions to amend the independent claim. So another way we can kind of reduce that issue is by interviewing with every office action. This is a common strategy. A lot of applicants do it. A lot of applicants shy away from it because it can be expensive. But it's particularly important in PPH cases because if your examiner will allow you to directly amend the claim, the independent claim, you're reducing the number of office actions. Now you can directly amend the independent claim if your examiner agrees, which sometimes happens, and you can get that placed into an interview summary. So interviews really take on a lot more importance in PPH cases because they very directly reduce the prosecution time.
Hmm.
Another strategy is to not be afraid to file continuation applications and abandon the original application. This sounds a little strange, right? So the idea is that you file the PPH application, the application gets accepted, and therefore a first office action issues quickly. PPH cases have a higher rate of allowance on the first office action compared to typical applications. I would assume that there's also a slightly higher chance of the indication of allowable subject matter in a dependent claim. But, this is still not frequently the case. Generally speaking, that won't happen. And so at that point, you have two options, right? You can either begin the process of prosecuting the application by, putting features into dependent claims or taking them from dependent claims and placing them in the independent claim, which again is very time consuming, it's very expensive. Or you can simply file a continuation application that is not in the PPH program. Why would I do that? Well, examiners will have some control over their ability to examine continuation applications. And so they will sometimes take their continuation applications sooner than they would take a regular new case, regular new application. This might change. I understand that there is a change in the docketing policy at the USPTO recently, or it's about to happen, But historically, this has been the case. And so applicants don't really lose much time by filing the continuation application. You'll still get examined much sooner than you typically would. In addition, when you file this continuation application, you can file a preliminary amendment with it. And the amendment, if necessary, would address the office action in the parent PPH case. Even if you don't amend the claims, even if you just present arguments, you can submit a letter that explains how I guess if you're filing a letter, you probably don't need to file a continuation. So I guess you are necessarily filing a preliminary amendment. But in this continuation with the preliminary amendment, you can address the office action in the parent. You can now directly amend the claims, right? So your prosecution will flow more smoothly. In addition, you've delayed the issuance of the first RCE, right? Because you've amended the claims once before the first office action in this continuation application. You should get a non-final office action in this continuation application. And then if necessary, you'll get a final rejection and then file an RCE later. So now you've got basically at least two, if not three bites at the apple, so to speak, three chances to amend before the RCE, as opposed to two, in addition to not being able to amend the independent claim directly in the parent. So, and then the original application goes abandoned. There's no need to continue it. Some clients might want to have both applications for some reason, just to get a varied scope of examination. But, it's going to cost so much more to continue prosecution in the parent PPH case that a lot of applicants just say, just let it go abandoned, and we'll take all the money we're saving there and put it into the child application.
はい。ここまで、PPH により審査というのは、通常の審査とはかなり異なるということを解説いただきました。では次に、クレーム補正において特徴を追加する際の注意点について解説いただきます。So, Brian-san, PPH prosecution is quite different from normal prosecution. Applicants may be surprised at how the PPH works in practice at the USPTO. Of course, applicants often discover allowable subject matter outside of PPH families. Is it possible to irk an examiner simply by trying to get a case allowed?
Yeah. So let's talk about allowable subject matter in foreign jurisdictions. So sometimes applicants expect that allowable subject matter in other jurisdictions is going to be allowable in the US. This issue is not limited to PPH cases, of course, but it's particularly relevant in such cases. And I sometimes handle global patent portfolios as well. And maybe I have an allowable feature in the US and I want to put it into the claims in Japan. So I definitely understand this urge to take what worked in one jurisdiction and hope that it works in another. The problem that we hear from USPTO examiners is that the applicant should always consider the relevancy to the outstanding rejection. In the US, the phrase is taking a square peg and putting it into a round hole. Like it's not going to fit exactly. And it's not a question of the feature, right? Clearly, some jurisdiction thought that feature was important. The issue is that the applicants in the US sometimes add the feature directly to the independent claim. And that's not right. I mean, it makes sense because that's what we're trying to get allowed. However, it might not be relevant to the rejection. And so your examiner is going to look at it and wonder why this amendment's being made. What does this have to do? How does this overcome the current art, for example? So a better option is to add these features via a dependent claim. Again, this isn't a jurisdiction like Japan where you're paying per claim necessarily. I mean, certainly once you get above 20 claims, you might be paying per claim. But, you do get 20 claims for filing the application. And so, if your application was originally filed with, between 7 and 10 claims, you still have a lot of room for dependent claims. And so there's a lot of room to add these features that were indicated as allowable in foreign jurisdictions. Maybe one's the Japanese prosecution, one's the European prosecution. In addition, the dependent claim fee is pretty modest in the US. And so the cost of adding a dependent claim, even if you pay the fee, can be lower than the cost of creating issues in the independent claim. What do I mean by that? So, if an applicant places some allowable subject matter from a foreign jurisdiction into the independent claim, it's going to confuse your examiner, your US examiner. They don't know why you're adding it. Even if you make a statement like, hey, claim 1 has been amended to incorporate allowable subject matter from Europe or from Japan, the examiner isn't really going to understand how that overcomes the rejection in the case. We don't give a lot of weight to allowable subject matter in foreign jurisdictions. For example, I've heard that Korea sometimes cares a bit more about what other jurisdictions found to be allowable. The U.S. is not like that. We really don't care what the EPO found as allowable. Much like the EPO probably doesn't care what we found allowable. And so, by adding these features into the independent claim, the examiner's not going to understand what you're doing. You might need to file an additional response to clear up some of the issues from adding the subject matter. You might need to file an RCE suddenly because prosecution is going in a different direction than what the examiner expected. This can be particularly true if you had an interview already and your U.S. representative and the examiner agreed on one amendment, and now we're going in a different direction. Your examiner is going to be confused as to why has there been this change. Ultimately, these kinds of amendments don't necessarily get the case allowed, and so the value of your claim might decrease because there's this feature that doesn't really fit into the I don't want to say that the examiners have a prosecution strategy. They don't know how the applicant will respond at each point. The examiners have some kind of idea of what they want to allow, I think. And if there's this feature that's coming in that's kind of out of place, I think that because we're deviating from the vision of the examiner, the overall patent might be narrower than it needs to be. Once it issues, the issued claim might be narrower than it needs to be.
Okay, thank you, Brian-san. So the issue is not the introduction of the allowable subject matter. The issue is how the allowable subject matter is introduced. It should always be okay in a dependent claim. However, it is not always okay in an independent claim. Thank you. はい、ブライアンさんありがとうございました。解説にあったように、クレーム補正において特徴を追加する際には、独立クレームに追加するのか、または従属クレームとして追加するのかに注意が必要であるということでした。はい、では、今回はこれで以上になります。ご質問や扱ってほしいトピックなどがありましたら、YouTube のコメント欄に書いていただくか、スライド最後に記載のメールアドレスまでお気軽にご連絡ください。では、本日もありがとうございました。失礼します。